Condemned by the Righteous, a sermon delivered by Dr. Rob Blackburn on March 3, 2013 at Central United Methodist Church in Asheville, North Carolina.
Our scripture passage for this morning comes from Mark, chapter 14, verses 53 through 65. Hear now the word of our Lord. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for a testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.'" But even on this point their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But he was silent and did not answer. And again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And all of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." The guards also took him over and beat him. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God.
"24 hours, one day that changed the world, and we've been walking with intensity into those hours. Remember where we started? We were there in a little room, and there was a supper. Jesus took the unleavened bread, the matzah, and he broke it and said, "Take and eat and do this." Not just the ritual, not just the meal, but my whole way of life in remembrance of me. Then last week we left the aroma of lamb and bitter herbs, the stuffy room, and we walked outside and we went into an olive grove, and we found Jesus there, face down in the dirt and clawing the ground and praying in anguish. But he rose to his feet, and he now had peace in his heart. His will converges with his Father's will, and he says to the disciples, "Get up now, move on." And he said, "There he is. It's the one who has turned on me." You know, he said that of Judas, but he could have said it of Peter, James, and John. Could have said it of the crowd that was applauding on Sunday and would be silent tonight. By the time it's all said and done, everybody either turned on or away from him. Even the religious leaders. You may not want to hear this, but Jesus didn't die because of atheism or anarchy. He died in the hands of the most pious and religious people on the face of that earth. It's not a pleasant story. Paint the narrative black with injustice. Paint the arrest green with jealousy. Paint the scene red with innocent blood. So here we are moving into the 24 hours, and we're going into a courtroom. It's just a courtroom that got thrown together. This is the Sanhedrin, 71 persons of the Jewish council. They have a high priest, it's Caiaphas. He's politically appointed. He's going to serve tonight as the district attorney. They would not normally meet in his home. That's where they're at. We're told they were meeting in the great hall of his palace. They would be meeting in the temple, but this is Passover. The temple was packed, and maybe this had an air of secrecy about it. I'm not sure, but there they are. If you add up all the gospel stories, you come up with 7 different interrogations of Jesus, from the Romans back to the Jews, the Romans and back. And this is the first of the trials of Jesus. You know, if you look at all the legal maneuverings and these different accounts, and you keep your eye on Jesus, and you see what He said and what He didn't have to say, if you pay attention to His peace amidst the hostility, His steadfast sense of purpose, you realize what's happening. He's bringing a whole lot of light into the room, and people are seeing themselves in ways they're not sure they're ready to see. It was an unusual night. It was Friday night in Broadway. It was the opening of Tennessee Williams' play, Night of the Iguana, starring Dorothy McGuire. And right before the curtain went up, a woman sitting down here toward the front. She was a middle-aged woman, hair somewhat disheveled, wearing a blue print dress. And she stood up, and she yells in a loud voice. She said, "Start the show, start the show. I want to see Dorothy McGuire." Well, people didn't know what to do. The people that were sitting around her kind of start distancing themselves the best they could from her. They didn't want to think the mad woman was a part of their group. And now the ushers come forward to try to get control, and when they reach for her, she pulls back and she yells again, "Start the show, I want to see Dorothy McGuire." Now at first the audience, it was, they didn't know what to do. They were silent. They were shocked. But now they say, "We have a mad woman in our midst," and they turned on her. It got ugly. They began to hiss and boo, and they said, Get that old bag out of here. Shut up, that lady." And they yelled, and she turned to the audience and said, "But I love Dorothy McGuire. I just want to see Dorothy McGuire." More cat calls, more hisses and boos, and then Dorothy McGuire comes out of the curtain. Play hasn't even opened. She comes out of the curtain, and in an act of rather unbelievable compassion and kindness, she left the stage and she walked down to where the woman was sitting, and she gently took her by the hand, said something to her, and they got up and they started moving to the exit. Right when they got to the exit, Dorothy McGuire, with the woman's hand in her hand, she turned to the audience and said, "I would like to introduce you to a fellow human being." Ooh. No more hisses and no more cat calls, and total silence. Silence by Dorothy McGuire's compassion and the realization of what they had done. They had put a human being on trial, and they found her guilty, and they convicted her of verbal abuse. But now it all turns, doesn't it? And it's the audience that's on trial. Now, when I read this account and the other trials of Jesus, what I keep kind of sensing through all this is the question that runs underneath. Who really is on trial here? Now, a court reporter would say, "We know who's on trial. Come on, I mean, whose name is on the docket? Which person has their arms in shackles? Who's being questioned? Jesus of Nazareth? Jesus is on trial. That's who. Easy answer." But no. If you listen to the gospel writers and the use of irony, if you listen to the shift of perspective and the revelation of the ambiguities of the accusers, well, you're not really sure who's on trial. I want you to listen again to the dialogue between Caiaphas and Jesus. Caiaphas playing kind of the role here of district attorney. And Caiaphas, can't you see him? You know, when people feel pretty comfortable in their place, maybe even a little smug, he's sitting in his own chair in his own great hall. Can't you see him just rolling, rocking that chair back? So he's just leaning up against the wall, sitting on the back legs of the chair. He's got his arms folded. He says, okay, Jesus of Nazareth, come on now. Tell us some of the things and a little bit of truths that you have been telling. In other words, here, let me give you rope long enough to hang yourself. Go on and wrap it around your own neck. And what does Mark say? Mark says, Jesus is just silent. It's the silence of strength. It's the silence of knowing, hey, everything I ever said, I said it in public. Said it in the synagogue, said it in the street, said it for you, for others, for anybody that wanted to hear it. It was there for the hearing. Pilate pushes a little more on the blasphemy business, the Messiah business. In the Gospel of John, this is when Jesus says, well, now wait a minute. I know my motivation. What's yours, Caiaphas? I mean, why is it that you're asking this of me? At this point, can't you see Caiaphas' chair going, thud? Come on. Wait a minute. Who's on trial here? Some years ago, there was this legend about a man who walks into a secondhand art store, picks up a cheap piece of art. It was nothing much to it, inexpensive, not that beautiful, but he thinks it'll add a little color to the living room, so he takes it home. There's a lot of dirt and grime, and he begins to wipe away the dirt and grime. And whoa, it's not just dirt and grime. The painting is beginning to dissolve, and there's something underneath that. Well, this is beyond his ability, so he brings in an art restorer who uses the right kind of solvent. And you know what they discover? That underneath that painting, that cheap painting he had bought, was a work of one of the masters. It's hard for me to read this story without thinking that beneath the cheap theatrics and cosmetics of the story and the trial of Jesus, there's another story. And in this story, Jesus isn't on trial. Caiaphas is on trial, and Peter and Judas and the crowd. By the time we're all said and done, we're like the audience in that Broadway theater. We're realizing that we're on trial here. Caiaphas is on trial. What would Caiaphas be on trial for? Fear. Good old basic fear that breaks down our relationships and that turns us against one another and God. Fear that gives way to political expediency. I got to hand it to Caiaphas. He's a good mathematician. He figured it this way. You know, it's better for one man to take it in the neck for the sake of many than for the many to take it in the neck for the sake of one. That's the mathematics of Caiaphas. And fear's at work. And fear's on trial here. We know something about fear, don't we? But I think something else is on trial here. This probably is going to get even closer to home. It's the sin of goodness. Goodness gone awry. Goodness that becomes self-righteousness. You see, that's what had turned the religious leaders against Jesus in the first place. At every twist and turn of his ministry, there they were. Oh, who are you having supper with? Why are you dealing with them? And they said, these people are on the outside. They're unclean. And then they would throw their stones of condemnation at Jesus. You're now unclean. These were the Pharisees. We're kind of hard on them. Jesus spent a lot of time with them, but he felt affinity with them. In his day, these were the folks that were the truth seekers. People trying to seek the living God. The problem is, they got to the point they weren't focusing on what God was doing in the world for all. They spent a lot of energy looking side to side. You know what happens if you look side to side? You start figuring who's got it right and who doesn't, who's like me and who's not. I know a man who shared with me this simple pattern of meditation he has in the morning. This is what happens. He says, I just kind of play back the tapes. It's like looking at a tape of a football game. I play back the tapes the previous day, decisions I made, conversations I had, and I try to think, how could I have been more focused, more loving, or more faithful? And he said, I had this one simple rule. I can only focus on myself, nobody else. Listen to what he says. He says, once you've decided to deal with your own stuff, you don't have a lot of energy and time left to worry about somebody else's. Yeah. But here were all these people. They were turning on Jesus as friends, looking side to side. Before that did him in, he turned on that. Remember his parable, the Pharisee and the publican? Remember that day? There was a woman face down in the street, and the religious people were taunting at her. There was talk of stoning, and Jesus said, here's a nice stack of stones. Come on. If you think anybody here is not in need of mercy, come on, pick up a stone. Be the first one to throw one. For Jesus, self-righteousness was a worse sin than being a thief, rogue, tax collector. Not that those things didn't represent serious stuff, but they were water soluble. They could be broken down by the mercy of God, but self-righteousness is oil-based. There's no recognition of need of mercy. It's hard for God to work with somebody who says, I've got it figured out. I'm doing pretty well on my own, thank you. I'm doing so well, I know those who aren't doing so well. Doesn't work. The sons and daughters of God get wounded by that. One of my friends was serving a church in Florida, and he told me this story. A 17-year-old girl in the church got pregnant, and the family dealt with it, and the child was put up for adoption. But she had a boyfriend. He rode around town on this big motorcycle, had a black leather jacket with about 100 zippers. You can get the picture. But she invited him to come to church. Lo and behold, he came to church, got baptized, and joined the church. But my friend who was the minister said, our church, we never really welcomed him. People thought they knew too much about him, and they wondered what kind of message that might send to the community. He said he stayed around for a while, but it wasn't long till he got up on his motorcycle and he rode away. One of the booby traps of being the people of faith is that our goodness can work against us. We work so hard at being good that we get very hard on those that we think are not so good. We have to talk about this here. Self-righteousness can slip in the back door. It's there before you know it. You never invite it in sometimes, but it's there. It's easy. I mean, when you give your life to the gospel, you become more sensitive and aware of things. You begin to feel things deeply and profoundly. But if we're not careful, we take that and we turn that on others. Sometimes even on the Son of God. The condemnation and judgment that had been turned on the friends that Jesus was trying to help now got turned full force on Jesus. And you say, but he wasn't a rogue. He wasn't a tax collector. No. But worse than that, you see, he exposed them. He exposed their very sin of goodness. Think about it. When you work really hard, when your major thrust in life is being good, and that's where your ultimate trust is, the worst thing is to have someone come along who knocks you off the pedestal of superiority. Barbara Brown Taylor said Jesus was killed because he was the far too perfect mirror. He brought too much light into the room. People who were accustomed to being in control and having others obey them, they came to see themselves as very spiritually handsome. But then the perfect mirror comes into the room and they see that their faces are so wooden, they might as well be masked. So how do you survive that? How do you look better again? Well, you did what they chose to do. Go on and eliminate Jesus the mirror. Who's on trial here? I would just have to say one way or another, we all are. This is a story that can be repeated in any time, in any place, and sometimes we are the perpetrators rather than the victims. I mean, our sin, your particular sin may not be that of self-righteousness. It may have a little more to do with some of the other players, the crowd, the apathy, the indifference. I don't know. I find there's enough roles in this story to go around for all of us. But here's the truth. There's no place to hide. Jesus is the light of the world, and the pretense of His integrity, in His light of His integrity, our pretense is exposed. The light of His fierce love, our lack of love is revealed. We look at the trial of Jesus and we see the man falsely accused and condemned. We know the truth. We know who's worthy to be condemned. Jesus said, let not your hearts be troubled. But Jesus, they are troubled because we're on trial here. There's no escaping it. The verdict rings out. Guilty. We have only one hope. One hope. That is that Jesus is the judge of all time. Our hope is in the mercy of the judge. Listen to what Paul said. Paul asked, who is to condemn? Paul said, Jesus, the one who died for us. And what does He do for us? He intercedes for us. We have everything to do with the death of Jesus, but His death has everything to do with giving us life. Go figure. Henry Nouwen tells this story of a fellow, his habit to go every day down to the Ganges River and to meditate. And he was under a large elm tree, and he was there doing his morning meditation. He sees a scorpion floating in the river. Now, a scorpion doesn't do well in the water, will drown soon. You could see the scorpion, it was struggling. So the man breaks out of his meditation, and he climbs out from this root from that elm tree that was reaching out into the water. And he gets as far as he can to the edge of that, and reaches out, and he grabs, trying to rescue the scorpion, and that scorpion just hits him with the stinger. Whoa! He pulls back, and he loses his balance, and, well, takes him a minute to shake his hand, get his balance again. But now the scorpion is really struggling. It's just caught in a little eddy there, and he goes back out as far as he can onto that edge of that root, and he reaches out, and boom, that scorpion gets him again. And this time his hand is swollen, and it's bleeding. And this passerby comes down the path and is seeing this scene unfold, and he says, "Oh man, what in the world do you think you're doing? What fool would try to rescue such an ugly and nasty creature? Why are you risking your hand and your life for a scorpion?" And the man looks into the face of the passerby, and this is what he says. "Just because it is the scorpion's nature to sting, that does not change my nature to save." There are moments and times it's hard for us to be honest about this, but that we sting the very hand of God that has stretched its way into the world. We're capable of denying and betraying, condemning, judging. But hear the good news, and it is good news. None of that changes the nature of God to save. Keep your eye on Jesus now. The condemned man, as he walks away, and what's he doing? He's praying. Praying for his accusers, his detractors, for you and me. Isn't that something? The one who came as love, remained love. Thanks be to God. Now, friends, what you see, some people before the service said, "What are the rocks on the?" I think there was a little fear factor. What are those rocks doing up there? And the preacher's got all the rocks. We don't have. It's all right. I'm not mad. It's okay. There are some baskets, each of the door, 4 baskets each of the doors of the church, and they have some river stones right here in our area. You're invited, as the last hymn is being sung, or as you leave today, if you so choose to take one. You know, that stone you pick out of the basket, it could mean any number of things. It could represent that part of us that wounds the children of God, the very love of God. It could be that part of us that we've just got to, at this moment, to be honest about. But you know, it could mean something else. It could represent the love of God that does not condemn, but the one that came as love remains love. It could remind you of that. Let us stand as we sing.